without further delay, over to you, Daniel.
Thanks so much, Larissa. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about the future of data in the cloud. So, I think I'd start with sort of where we're coming from at this. As Larissa said, I'm from Looker, which is part of Google Cloud for the last 8 or 9 months now. And, Looker's mission for as long as it's been around has really been about empowering people through the smarter use of data. And we really do see people as the key there. Nobody actually wants data for data's sake. People want information, they want answers to their questions, they want to do their jobs better. And so fundamentally, those are the questions that we need to be asking. How do we provide that? Not how do we provide data? And today I want to talk about sort of 3 big trends that I'm sure won't surprise any of you, but that I think are really critical to thinking about as we sort of map our path forward. The first is that there is just this explosion of applications inside the enterprise. Many of those are SaaS applications that are living in the cloud, but not only. But regardless, there's just a huge number of enterprises that people are using today. The second is that everybody in the enterprise wants access to data. And it used to be just analysts, but now that desire for data is really widespread. And the third is just on the data infrastructure side, there's been this huge, maybe not even an evolution, maybe a revolution in what's possible using the tools that are available to us architecturally. So I want to dive into each of those trends individually. So the first trend is really about the supply side, right? The number of business applications that are used inside the average application has exploded. And you can just realize this if you think for a second about how many SaaS applications you've used today. I mean, just thinking about my own world, I've used 2 different chat applications. I've used email, obviously. I've used Calendar, obviously. I used Instacart to order some groceries, which, not a business application, but a SaaS application that produces lots of data. I've used an expense report app. So just, anywhere inside the enterprise that you ask people what they're doing, they're going to say, oh, I'm using apps to get my job done. And if you think about it, each of those apps is fundamentally a data application. And the people who use it may not think of it that way, but that is really what it is, right? If you're a marketer who spends a lot of time every day in Google Ads, changing bids, tuning campaigns, you're putting data into the Google Ads app. If you're a salesperson who's sitting in front of Salesforce, updating your forecast so that your manager can track completion to quota, that's putting data into the Salesforce app. If you're a support rep sitting in front of Zendesk, tagging your tickets so that people can understand what are the parts of your application that are causing the most problems, or what are the systems causing the most problems. Again, you're putting data into the application. Even my wife, who's a Pilates instructor, all of the time that she doesn't spend teaching Pilates when she's working is spent in an app, scheduling people, setting up classes, moving people around, deciding, whether something should be a beginner class or an advanced class. And so the question is not, will we put data into applications? Because we definitely will. There's no question about that. The question is, will we be able to ask questions of that data and get useful answers back? And most of the time, unfortunately, the answer is no. If my wife knows that application she uses for scheduling has enormous amounts of valuable data about, which classes fill up the fastest, whether it's better to have an advanced class on Friday morning or a beginner class, which of her clients are actually going to show up when they book. All of that information is in the application, but she doesn't have any way to access it. And unfortunately, that's true for a lot of business people, whether they're using Google Ads or Salesforce or Zendesk or any other application. And so what happens is these business people, they go to their analysts and they say, hey, there's some data that I want access to that lives in a few of these applications. Can you pull that data out so I can put it in a workbook and, slice it and dice it and understand it a little bit? And the data people, IT or analytics, say, yeah, sure, we can manage that. So they pull the data out. And they give it over in a workbook, and the person, works with it. And that seems pretty manageable. It seems like a reasonable way to deal with this. Now we're actually getting some of that data back out and getting answers to our questions, right? The problem is it's never just one person in one department who wants access to the data. Instead, what very quickly becomes clear is that you've got lots of people in lots of different departments, all of whom want access to lots of different data sources. And those data sources, they overlap, but they're never quite exactly the same, and they don't need to be, transformed in just exactly the same way. So everyone's needs are a little bit different. And so what you end up with is all of these different data silos where people are, getting extracts, getting little bits of the data, their own little view of the data with their own extract and, looking at it in their own way. But that means that nobody can really talk across those silos. And so what you end up with is analytics isolation. And you can see this everywhere. Each of the deployments, each of the departments, their needs are a little bit different. So nobody can just reuse what someone else has already done. That becomes very difficult to manage for IT or for the data analytics department because they're maintaining all of these parallel systems rather than doing it in one system. It makes sharing across departments really hard because everybody's in their own little silo. So they're not comparable. You can't just take data from one place, go to the other, and get an easy comparison. And you get these very brittle systems because they're being built quickly and they're not really built for maintainability. And so they don't scale well, they break a lot, they cause a lot of problems. People start relying on them, but then they're not reliable. So that's tricky. And so what happens is the decision-making that you can do inside the business ends up being constrained by the data silos. And that's not what anyone wants, right? We don't want to have to decide, well, where can we use data and where can we not use data based on the technology? We want to use, our intuition and say, it would be useful to be able to connect this data and this data. We would be able to make a better decision. And so let's do that. But we can't do that because the silos are in the way. So that's the first trend on the supply side. Now let's talk about the demand side, right? So trend number 2 is just that everybody needs data. And part of this is that we've been conditioned to expect data in our personal lives. I was talking about using Instacart. Well, whatever apps you're using in your personal life, there's data there waiting for you, right? If you're placing orders online, they're going to tell you, how quickly the order is going to ship, how much it's going to cost to ship it via one method versus another, when it would arrive, all of that. If you pull out the little magic device in your pocket, it's going to give you a rundown of how much you've spent in the last month, what kinds of things you're buying and what you might want to buy again. If you're going somewhere, you can compare methods of getting there and see, how much would they cost and how long would they take. Even when we're chilling in the evening, we expect data to guide our way, to say, hey, based on the things that you've already watched, based on what you enjoyed, we think you would like this, right? So people use data in their everyday lives. And so naturally, they expect when they come to work, the data is going to be as available to them there. Unfortunately, as most of us know, that's not true, right? And so what happens is you have all of these data workers, this data hungry workforce, and they may not think of themselves really as data workers, but they are, and they want access to data to answer their questions, but it's not there, it's not available, And if you're a DevOps engineer, you probably don't think of yourself as a data worker, but what are you doing? You're looking at data about, your utilization rate, how much different, cloud spend you're doing in different places and on different services, how much you could save by reserving instances rather than paying for spot instances. You're looking at data and making decisions about them. If you're a customer success manager, what do you want? You want data about which of your customers is in the most trouble and likeliest to churn so that you can, go spend time with them ahead of time to try to stop them from churning. If you're a product manager, you want to see, how quickly are we shipping things? Are we, cutting down on the number of bugs that make it to our customer, right? So all of these people are fundamentally asking questions that should be answerable with data. And, not surprisingly, we know that companies that figure out how to use data effectively are more likely to grow revenue, and they build a competitive advantage because, the ability to use data well gives you a big advantage over your competitors who can't use that data, right? It gives you more insight, more ability to make better decisions than your competitors have. And once you learn how to do that, that becomes sustainable. It gives you, not just a transient advantage, but one that grows over time. So, okay, so we've laid that out, right? We have more supply than ever before. We have more demand than ever before. So that seems great. Why are those two things not connected, right? And the answer, in part at least, unfortunately, for those of us who really like business intelligence and analytics, is that as long as we're using the same old tools, the same old BI tools, we're not going to reach everybody. That's an important thing to admit because, it's only by admitting that we have that problem that we can move forward. And, this stat hurts me every time I see it, but the reality is most companies are still using Excel for the majority of their BI. That's not a real BI tool. Excel is great. I love Excel, but it's not the tool that you should be using inside your company to make business critical decisions about your data. So, that sounds like a downer, but I'm here to tell you that there is hope. There is a better way. And a big part of the sort of better way is about the third trend here, that the data infrastructure that's available to us has evolved. It has really changed dramatically from what was available, 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And, if you look to data engineering, that's where a lot of the hope comes from, right? So first of all, databases today are not the databases or data warehouses of yesteryear. They, for those of us who grew up in a time where databases were really expensive, they were slow, they had to be on premise, that is not the world of today. Today, databases are bigger, they're faster, they're cheaper, they run in the cloud. That is not the same as it used to be. The second thing is that, in addition to being more powerful, these databases are also a lot more flexible. And so what that means is the old way of doing things where you had to do a really pure ETL, where you extracted the data from the data source, transformed it and manicured it and got it just in the right shape so that the database could handle it and then loaded it. Those days are gone. Today, you can do something much more like an ELT, where you extract the data, you load it into the database pretty much raw, and then you do your transformation in the database. And that gives you a lot more flexibility and agility. And then the third piece, and this is great for those of us who make our living in part by knowing SQL. SQL, the sort of standard lingua franca of data analysts, is very much staying the standard. So if you are worried about your SQL skills not going to use, do not worry. They absolutely will be of great use going forward. And, to focus in on the cloud databases for a second, they really have changed our world, right? It's not a question of whether we'll move to cloud databases. It's just a question of how quickly at this point. Gartner predicts that by 2023, 75% of all of databases in the world will be in the cloud. And what that gives us is it gives us an unthinkable scale, right? Cloud databases can just handle more data than ever before. Gives us power and performance, but it also gives us elasticity. So we don't have to pay for the most power we ever might need. We can just pay for power as we need it, spin up more resources to deal with really tough, big queries, and then spin them down and stop paying for them. So that lowers our cost. It makes it much easier for us to use. We don't have to do as much estimation around workloads. And the cloud databases that are out there also give us better security because, instead of only relying on ourselves and our security teams to keep everything secure, now we can, join forces with the security engineers of the cloud companies that are hosting our databases. So it's more people thinking about how to keep data secure. So, given those three trends, I think it naturally leads to the question, well, what is the future of data, right? If those three trends are happening, where is data going? And I think we can look to those three trends to get some sort of guiding principles about where data is going and where we want data to go. So the first is just, the rise in applications, the rise in SaaS applications and all of the data exhaust that they put off is not slowing down. In fact, it's accelerating. And so anything that we're going to build, any, sort of future state of our analytics stack needs to be built in a way that's going to be able to handle that and flex as the needs change, right? That's the first thing. The second is that, with this data-driven workforce, the demand for data is only going to grow. And what that means is we need to be thinking not just about how do we turn our data into a nice dashboard, but rather also how do we deliver actionable insight to the people who need it? And how do we put it in their hands right where they already are, right? How do we make it so they don't have to come to us, but when something important is happening and the data tells us that, we can use that data to put it right in their hands, whether they're in Salesforce or Slack or Teams, or putting it on their phone. We want to be really proactive in putting the data in their hands. And then the third thing is that, we need a stack that can fully take advantage of today's modern data warehouses, right? Because one of the great things about all of the different amazing options that are out there in terms of modern data warehouses, whether you're using something like Google's BigQuery or Amazon Redshift or Athena or Snowflake or one of the other options, there's so many good options and the competition is so fierce that they're all constantly innovating and evolving. And so, we not only get the best of today, but we want to be able to take full advantage of the best of tomorrow. So really what that points us to is, we said earlier that the world of today too often looks like this, where there's each of these little silos built on top of this, monster lake of data. And where we actually want to go is more to this, to a data or an analytics platform, right? So you've still got all of the richness and the sort of complexity underneath in that data lake. But as you start to put that into one of the modern data warehouses, you want to put a big, broad platform on top that is able to serve all of the different use cases, all of the different needs, but in a way that drives towards reusability, right? That stops siloing people in their own little world and instead gives everyone access across the board in a way that is shared and reusable and shareable. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Looker and sort of how we approach this. So, the thing about Looker is that we're really thinking about how do you go beyond BI, right? Because it's not that BI and business intelligence are going away. They certainly are not. Dashboards and reports continue to be immensely valuable. It's instead that we need to think bigger about what we can do with data and analytics, right? If you think about the first BI tools were all about delivering dashboards to a small group of executives, so maybe tens or hundreds of people. And then as people started to do analytics on their own workbooks of data, we expanded into thousands of people in an enterprise doing analytics, and that's great. But now we need to think bigger. We need to think about how do we reach millions of people or tens of millions of people or hundreds of millions of people with data, right? And the only way to do that is to think beyond just a dashboard. So with Looker's analytic platform, what you're getting is that sort of big, broad surface that you can build on top of. And so the things that are really critical there, one is that you've got governed metrics. And so what that means is that you've got a semantic layer or a semantic model that's sitting on top of your data warehouse, and it's taking all of your analysts' knowledge about what your data means, and it's putting it into that platform so that everybody can access it, so that you're not having to wait in line for access to the analyst because they're the keepers of the knowledge, right? It's about giving people software that scales much more easily and cheaply than having to hire dozens or hundreds more analysts. So those governed metrics are really at the core of Looker. How do you build metrics that are version controlled and right and trustworthy, that span the whole of your business, but that are going to make a lot of sense to the business users, where they're not going to have to learn the specifics of, how are we defining lifetime customer value this week? Because I know it changed. No, they shouldn't have to track that. They know that lifetime customer value is an important metric for their job. And so they should just be able to say, I need lifetime customer value, and know that the analytics platform can interpret that and get the right data. So that's number one. Number two is, having a big broad surface, you need APIs because, of course, sometimes people are going to want to sort of tap into that data directly, but a lot of times you're going to want to build on that and connect it to other systems. And the way to do that is with APIs. So Looker gives you that. Looker manages your database connections so that you can access data that lives in multiple places at once without having to worry about where it lives, because that's not something a business user should have to worry about. As I said, it gives you version control via Git so that, if a metric changes, you can say, well, why did this change? Who changed it? When did they change it? Let me see the difference between the old metric and the new one so that, it's really easy to make that comparison. It gives you, security and access control, and it's all running in the cloud. And so once you have that analytic platform in place, what you can start to do then is you can, of course, do modern BI and analytics on top of it, right? So build interactive dashboards and reports that run in your browser. But you can also start to integrate insights from that platform into the other tools that people are already using, right? So that might mean that a salesperson logs into Salesforce and without even having to ask for it, they go to an account page, and right there on the account page is a chart showing, how much the customer is using the product, so that they can use that knowledge to, make a sale. It might mean that, you're working in Slack with your colleagues and you want to show them something, and you just paste a link from Looker and it says, hey, do you want me to put the chart here? And it expands and shows the chart so that you all can have a discussion about it, right? So it really is about bringing that data into the context where people already are. It also might mean, data-driven workflows. So these could be human in the loop, where, the Looker kicks off a workflow and sends data to someone and says, hey, website traffic is up 20%. Maybe you don't know why. You go digging around and you see that you were featured on a review site or something. And so that, ability to drive a workflow and tell people about it so that they can do the right thing is really important. But often it's actually not even human in the loop. It's, entirely automated, where, you might have a dynamic pricing engine that needs data as an input about how much, people are spending on different products on your website so that it can price them accordingly. And there might not be a human, involved in that at all. And Looker can power those as well. And then finally, and we see, this a ton, people often are building whole custom data applications on top of Looker. They're using a mixture of Looker's APIs and the ability to embed, via iframes or JavaScript, and building whole custom experiences so that, the end user has no idea that they're using a data tool. They would certainly not say they're using a BI tool, but the data is right there. It's infused into the experience that they're having. So that's really, what Looker powers. And, to give a sort of different view on that, you can think of it in sort of three layers, right? You've got all that data underneath, you've got the robust platform in the middle, and then you've got all the different, use cases and workflows on top. And the way that Looker does that, I think there are sort of four key pillars that are worth understanding. So the first is that, Looker is fast on any size data. No matter how big your data is, Looker is going to stay fast. And the reason is because Looker is built to fully leverage the database or data warehouse or data engine or data lake that you're using underneath, right? Looker is not extracting bits of the data and putting it in a proprietary data engine. It's instead saying, hey, you've invested in something like BigQuery or Snowflake or Redshift. We want to use the full power of those tools. So we're going to let them do what they're really good at, which is querying huge amounts of data very quickly. We're going to, leverage all of that power. And so Looker is unique in its architecture, fully leveraging the capabilities of those tools. So that's number one. Number two, and I talked about this a little, is this semantic model, right? So what that means is that everybody can get trusted answers. It means that, the business users don't have to worry about what's going on behind the scenes, and they also don't have to wait in line for access to an analyst. They can just get access to the analyst's knowledge through software. And for the analysts, they love it because they're not stuck answering the same question or variations on the same question over and over and over again. Instead, they're able to answer the question once in the software and then know that people are going to be able to self-serve, but in a way where they're going to get the right answer. Because too often what happens is people self-serve, but it becomes chaos very quickly. People are, spinning the data their own way or trying to interpret it without the real, domain-specific knowledge to be able to do that well. And so they get an interpretation, they make business decisions, but they realize that they did something very wrong, and now you're in real trouble. So the third thing is, as I said, Looker is a platform, and so it's running in the cloud. There's no desktop version that you download. So that means everybody's using the same version of Looker, and it means that it's really easy to connect Looker to all of the other tools that people are already using in your enterprise. We talked about how many tools people are using in their enterprise, and so the ability to connect Looker to all those other tools really easily means that you can integrate insight into all of those other tools and meet people in the context they're in. And then the last piece is just, Looker is built for developers. So that does not mean that you have to be a software developer to get benefit from Looker. Far from it. Instead, what it means is that Looker is all about using the smart ideas that software developers have come up with about building and maintaining complex systems and bringing them into data analytics, right? So it means that we really think about data from a software lifecycle development perspective. We think about, well, how are we going to use version control? How are we going to give each data modeler or data analyst their own little sandbox where they can play with the data and try out new data definitions without affecting anybody else. But then once they're ready to push that new definition to production, how are we going to make sure that that takes effect globally so that we're not tracking down dashboards that still have the old definition, right? Because we don't want to do that. That leads to chaos. So those four things are really the core of sort of how Looker works. And there are thousands of companies that are using Looker to be successful today, that are using it to sort of respond to those three trends and go beyond BI. And so, I think what this all leads us to recognize is that the future of data is not only business intelligence, right? It's not to rule out business intelligence by any means. I think BI will very much remain a big part of how we use data in enterprises, but it is not only business intelligence. There's so much more. And when we think about what's possible with a data platform, I think it's really about going back to a time very early on when data was very locked down. So you knew you were getting sort of unified, trusted, and complete views of the business, but doing so in a way that doesn't actually lock the data down, right? It was great that you could trust the data, but not so great that, the data was so locked down that nobody could really, add new metrics or learn from it or be agile. Now we can have the best of both worlds. We can stay agile, but still get those trustworthy metrics. The second thing is that, a data platform is all about a new architecture that takes advantage of the best in breed options today and sets you up to take advantage of the best tools of tomorrow. So as the ecosystem evolves, because it absolutely will, you want a tool that's going to be able to flex and scale to keep up with that technological innovation and also with the innovation in what your business needs. And then finally, a data platform, because it's not just a workbook tool, a tool that's running on your desktop, but is instead this sort of big, broad surface. It's something that can deliver those actionable insights to where people already are. And that's just going to drive your adoption up, up, up in a way that a tool never could, because people are resistant to learning new tools. But if you give them the data that they need to ask better, to answer their questions better and make better decisions right in the tools that they're already using, of course, they're going to make use of that. So that's a little bit about sort of how we see the situation evolving, how we see the sort of trends driving people towards a data platform. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that resonated and you're seeing some of those same things in your enterprises. But I'd love to take any questions and talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So I have one question. How to provide a safe, stable, and scalable environment that supports operations and provides quick response?
Absolutely. So I think it's a great question. And I think actually one of the really interesting things to me about sort of Looker's history is that we very much started as an operational tool. People often think of sort of analytic tools as ones that are, for sort of slowly working through the data, the historical data, and, getting a sense of what happened, and you can sort of take your time. But operational tools have very different needs, right? They need to be up to the second to tell you what's happening now so that you can react. And so, I think the idea of being operational, of presenting operational metrics to people in real time is sort of core to Looker's DNA. And, the fact that Looker is sitting directly on top of people's databases means that we're not introducing any latency that usually would come where you're sort of extracting data from those tools, maybe cleaning it up, and then, importing it into a workbook and then starting to work with it. And the data is getting stale that whole time, right? So the fact that Looker is sitting directly on top of the database, and often those are operational databases like MySQL or PostgreSQL or Aurora, that means that people can get a view of what's happening right now. We have lots of customers who, run fulfillment warehouses or, e-commerce stores, and they need to know what's the availability of a particular item, what's their inventory look like right now, so that they can make decisions about pricing and, what things can stay up on their website, how to run sales, and that needs to be up to the second. And so they're using Looker, sometimes even on the warehouse floor, to make decisions in real time about what's happening with their inventory. And, I think those kinds of operational use cases are really sort of close to our heart and something that we love seeing our customers do. But it's a great question.
Awesome. What are the key considerations when transitioning data and analytics to the cloud, Daniel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, obviously, everyone is at the very least considering moving to the cloud, and some companies are quite far along, and some companies are still at the beginning of their journey. And so we get this question a lot, like, what are the key things I should be looking for as I move to the cloud? So, I'd lay out a few. First of all, at this point, I just kind of assume that everyone is going to be in a multi-cloud or hybrid world. That's not to say that there aren't companies that are completely centralized on a single cloud. They do exist, but they're the exception, not the norm. So, don't be freaked out about that. And that's quite normal. So I think it's important to look at the different cloud options and think about, what technologies each of them offer that meet your specific needs, and make decisions about where to move based on that. The second thing I'd say is that, part of the reason that we see so much hybrid cloud, where people still have some stuff running on premise and some stuff in the cloud, is because moving to the cloud is a journey. It's not something that you just do in a weekend and then you're done. It might take years, and that's okay. There might even be some workloads that you want to keep on premise permanently, and that's totally fine. So, I think looking for the opportunities where there would be real benefits to moving to the cloud, whether that's lower total cost of ownership or, being able to take advantage of some newer technologies, or, just lowering your IT spend. I think all of those are great reasons to move workloads to the cloud. And so I think it's about identifying some first opportunities, not trying to boil the ocean by doing it all at once, but doing it sort of piece by piece. And, I think it's also why, from Looker's perspective, it's so important that we be able to give companies a view of what's happening with their data across all of the places where that data lives. Because, again, while some companies do have all of their data centralized in a single warehouse, that's not the norm. And so we often have companies that say, well, I have my operational data that's still in a transactional database on premise, but then I've moved the historical data to, BigQuery so I can do larger scale analysis, and I want to sometimes be able to look at those side by side. How can I do that? And, from Looker's perspective, we really don't care where the data lives. It's kind of immaterial, because at the end of the day, Looker is, just sending the query off to the database and bringing the results back so you can sort of visualize it and ask follow-up questions. And so cutting down on the amount of data and data extraction that's happening, the amount of data sort of, being sent over the wire, and the data extraction that's happening really makes it easier to operate in a world of multi-cloud and hybrid cloud.
Brilliant. Daniel, why integration and transformation each needs to be considered separately in data governance policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think when people say data governance, they actually often mean sort of two different things. One is about sort of access control, making sure that everyone only has access to the data that they need and not to more data than they need or should have access to. And then the other is about sort of governing the metrics themselves. So it's more about data quality and making sure that the answers that people are getting from the data are right, because you don't want people make it like, I'd rather that somebody make a decision based on their gut than think that they have data backing up their decision, but actually have the wrong data or be misinterpreting it. So it's really important to not just govern, where the data is and who has access to it, but also how they're interpreting it, and what those metrics look like. So to your question about sort of integration and transformation, I think, as I said, we're seeing more and more that those steps can sort of happen sequentially and can happen almost in a different order than they used to, right? It used to be that you sort of extracted the data into flat files and then had to do all of the sort of integration and transformation in this big, very heavyweight ETL step. And there were great reasons for that. That was because the tools that could handle that much data, those batches, and could do all of that, only could operate sort of offline in a batch processing way. And so you obviously couldn't land all of that data in its messy real world state in your data warehouse. Your data warehouse would fall over. That wasn't going to work. But today, you can take a much more iterative approach to how you're doing sort of data integration, data enrichment, data transformation, and do it sort of in bits and pieces. And what that lets you do is stay much more agile, because the closer to runtime that you're doing a transformation, the more flexible that is going to be, and the more you're going to be able to sort of prototype new things, make changes on the fly. The earlier in the pipeline that you're doing this work, the more sort of locked down it's going to be, and the harder it's going to be to change. If you've got something very, very early in a pipeline, then what you're going to have to do anytime you change it is reprocess all of the data, and that's painful and can easily take weeks or months. So I think what we're seeing is that, companies that are really figuring out how to advance their data practice are figuring out, which are the transformations or the integrations that we know they're not going to change. We want to filter out all of the test data because we know that data is not valuable, and, we don't need to worry about that. Well, that's something that could probably be done very early in your pipeline, because that's not likely to change. But, we're doing some prototyping of a new metric that we think might be useful to our line of business users. Well, that's something that you want to, you're prototyping. You don't know if it's going to be useful. So that's something you want to start, doing very close to runtime. Do that transformation at the last possible second, so that you can present that metric to your users, see if it's useful. And then if it becomes useful and, you need to make it more performant and more available, then maybe you start to push it backwards in your pipeline. But, I describe it as people have moved away from ETL, and they're not in a world of sort of pure ELT, but instead what they're living in is a world that's like E, little bit of T, then the load, then like a big transformation after load, and then a little bit of transformation, and then maybe a little runtime transformation. And so it's a much more, iterative, flexible, agile process. It's very different than the world that people used to live in. And frankly, the availability of vendors and technologies that make those transformations much easier to manage than ever before also means that you can do it in a matter of sometimes minutes or hours. You can set up a pipeline, whereas in the past, it might have taken you 6 months.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. Daniel,
pleasure.
It was an amazing session. Thank you so much.